I worked as a waitress in a small corner restaurant, the kind with regular customers and a pretty predictable routine. I'd been there for about 6 months, and up until then, nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. I was a pretty private person, so even though I saw the same people every day, no one really knew much about me beyond the basics. I liked it that way, and it was easy to keep things quiet since I always took the late shifts when it was less busy, so I could slip out unnoticed. But a few weeks ago, I started noticing this one customer who'd show up almost every day during my shift. At first, he didn't really stand out, just a middle-aged guy, graying hair, with that tired look a lot of our customers had after a long day. But over time, he started to make me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't quite explain. He always sat in the same corner, ordered the same thing, a cheeseburger with fries, nothing special, and he'd just sit there watching the room in this odd way. Sometimes, when I was nearby taking orders or cleaning a table, I'd feel his eyes on me. I tried to ignore it, since you get used to certain looks working as a waitress. But unlike most people, he never looked away. And one time, when I brought his order over, he asked me my name. I answered without thinking, but I immediately regretted it. He gave me this weird smile, thanked me, and kept eating. But from then on, it felt like he knew exactly how to unsettle me. After that day, he started asking me questions. Always personal stuff, like if I was in school or if I lived close by. I'd answer with a quick yes or no and get away as fast as I could, but he'd keep pressing. Once, he even brought up my work schedule, like he'd already memorized my routine. He asked if I went out after work, if someone came to pick me up, questions that sounded normal enough but had this strange edge to them. Every time he showed up, my whole body tensed, like some part of me knew this wasn't just some random guy making small talk. At the end of one especially long night, when the place was nearly empty, he was the last customer, slowly sipping his coffee. I was counting down the minutes until he left, and when he finally did, I saw he'd left a way bigger tip than usual. He never really tipped before, so that caught me off guard. I tried to brush it off, but deep down, something told me this was some kind of message. In the days that followed, he showed up almost every night around the same time, right when my shift started to calm down. It was weird, like he knew the exact moment I'd be less busy. I tried not to look at him, but he always seemed to wait for me to make eye contact. One night, as I brought him his check, he mentioned the color of my nail polish, something I'd only changed the week before. And he didn't stop there. He commented on my earrings, even the brand of my bracelet. It creeped me out because no one notices details like that, and he'd only ever seen me at work. It was after a late shift one night, as I headed to the bus stop, that I realized just how much this was messing with my head. I walked over to the bus stop and saw a car parked across the street, lights off. It wasn't common to see cars parked there that late. I felt a chill down my spine, but tried to convince myself it was nothing. Then the car's headlights flicked on, and it started moving slowly in my direction. It was him, of course. He drove by me, real slow, like he wanted to get a good look. At that moment, fear turned into full-on panic. After that night, I started feeling watched all the time. At work, I tried to act normal, but it was like he knew exactly what he was doing to me. I even asked to change shifts, but my manager said it'd be tough to find someone willing to cover the later hours. So, I stayed, but now I always made sure to have someone walk me to the bus stop, even if I just played it off as just to be safe. I didn't want my coworkers thinking I was paranoid, but it was really starting to get to me. A few days later, I got home exhausted and went straight to the shower. My mind was still stuck on his stares, his questions, how he always seemed to know things about me. Then, as I stepped out of the bathroom and looked in the mirror, I saw something that froze me in place. A note, written in messy handwriting. It talked about intimate details, mentioning the color of my underwear from a week before. Something only I should know. I stood there, completely paralyzed, like the floor had disappeared beneath me. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound in the house had me on edge, like he was right outside, watching me. The next day, I went to work, but my mind was racing. Even while serving tables, my eyes kept darting to the door, expecting him to walk in at any moment. And he did, of course. This time, he stayed longer than usual, never taking his eyes off me, like he was studying my every move. The tension was unbearable, and when my manager called me at the end of the shift, I thought about telling him everything, but the words just wouldn't come out. Later that same night, as I walked to the bus stop, I saw a car parked a little ways down, lights off. My instincts told me to run, but my legs felt like lead. That's when I decided to act. I took out my phone and pretended to call the police, saying loudly that someone was following me and giving the exact location of where I was. The car's headlights switched on, and it sped off. The next morning, I got news from the police that a man with multiple harassment complaints had been arrested that night. It was him. Since then, I haven't seen him again, but even now, when I look in the mirror, I sometimes wonder if he's really gone for good or if he'll come back someday to haunt me. It was a different kind of Thanksgiving night for us. Instead of a loud, lively dinner, everything was a little too calm. Maybe because the weather outside was terrible. It was freezing cold, the kind of night where you're just grateful to be inside, away from the biting wind. My mom was finishing up setting the table, loaded with our family's classic dishes, while we settled on the couch, waiting for her to call us over. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a soft knock on the door, so faint it almost went unnoticed. My dad got up to answer it, and when he opened the door, there stood an elderly woman, shivering in the cold. She was wrapped in layers of old, dark clothing, but it still seemed like the cold had gotten right into her bones. She barely said a word, just looked at us with deep, tired eyes, like every word would weigh a ton. She said she was lost, that was all. My mom, ever the helpful type, brought her inside right away, insisting she warm up, and asked her where she lived, if we could help her get home. But the lady just shook her head slowly, with this empty look, murmuring that she wasn't quite sure where she lived anymore. It felt strange, but it was so cold out there we didn't think twice. We set a place for her at the table, and my mom served her a full plate. The lady took the silverware with shaky hands, and we all just stared, trying to figure out who she was and how she'd ended up alone in weather like this. As dinner went on, you could feel something wasn't quite right. The old lady ate slowly, almost silently, and the mood at the table got tense, you know? That weird silence no one can break. I noticed she never really looked at anyone, just stared at her plate or glanced at the window, like she was waiting for someone to show up outside. And then, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The cuffs of her coat sleeves had these dark stains, like damp soil, and there was this faint, unmistakable smell of earth, like something freshly dug up. My sister, sitting across from her, seemed to notice it too. She kept fiddling with her napkin, eyeing the lady with this wary look, and every time the old woman took a bite, my sister looked away, like it bothered her in some way. My dad tried to make small talk a couple of times, asking simple questions, like if she remembered where she'd been going before she got lost, but she only mumbled these vague answers. The only clear thing she mentioned was a name, Samuel. She said it with such sadness that we all just went quiet, not really knowing what to say. After dinner, my mom suggested the lady rest a bit in the living room. We set up a cozy spot for her, with a warm blanket and some tea, while we started clearing the kitchen. But soon after, when my mom went back to check on her, the lady was gone. I can't explain it, but we all felt this sudden spike of nervousness. The house wasn't that big, and we would have noticed if she'd left. Even so, my dad opened the front door to see if she'd just slipped out without a word, but all that greeted him was the cold. The snow had started piling up, and outside, there was nothing, not a single track. As we looked around, I noticed marks on the floor. Thin mud stains, like someone with wet shoes had walked through the living room and down the hall. It seemed impossible, since the house was closed up and none of us had gone outside since she arrived. Following the marks, which led up to the second floor, I felt the air grow heavier, like the house itself was absorbing this strange presence. My parents followed me, and with each step, the earthy smell got stronger. The marks ended right in front of my bedroom. I pushed the door open slowly, and there she was, sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at something in her hands. I froze, just standing there because, for a second, I wasn't sure if I should say something or just run out of there. The old woman was holding an old photograph, worn around the edges, and she was mumbling the name, Samuel, over and over. like he was right there with us. The way she held the photo was unsettling, her fingers trembling but clutching it tightly, like it was the last thing that mattered to her. I tried to call for my mom, but my voice barely came out as a whisper. The lady finally looked up and, for the first time, looked directly at me. Those eyes, so deep and filled with something I can only describe as despair, stayed with me. Without a word, she stood up, left the photo on my bed, and walked out of the room as if nothing had happened. We followed her down the hall, but when we turned the corner, she was just gone. We searched the entire house, but it was like she'd never even been there. And the photo she left behind? It was an old portrait that looked like it had been taken decades ago. In the end, we tried to find some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. We talked about what we'd seen, each of us describing the lady the same way. The dark clothes, the smell of earth, the empty gaze. My mom even tried calling the local authorities to see if anyone had reported a missing elderly woman matching her description, but there were no records of anyone like her. It was as if she was a ghost, someone who didn't belong to our time or reality. That night, none of us could sleep properly. Her image, sitting on my bed with that photo, kept coming back to my mind. I spent days thinking about Samuel, wondering who he was and why she'd come to our house. The photo, though, disappeared. The next day, it wasn't where she'd left it, and none of us had any idea where it went. Even now, years later, I still think of that night whenever I catch the faint smell of damp earth. It was a few years ago, right after Thanksgiving dinner. I was at my sister's house, and we were all gathered around the table, laughing, stuffing ourselves with turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. Just the typical holiday stuff. I was in my 30s at the time, always kind of a loner, so family gatherings like this are pretty rare for me. My sister and her husband have 3 kids, and they live in a big house at the end of the city. Nothing too strange about it. Just an old suburban house with creaky floors and a lot of rooms. Anyway, after we finished eating, I went outside to have a smoke. The night was cold, the air biting, and the stars were out in full force. It was one of those calm, almost peaceful nights. While I was smoking, I could hear my nephews laughing inside, playing some game. A few minutes later, I tossed the cigarette on the ground and went back inside. When I opened the door, I was greeted by the usual noise. Kids running around, my sister and her husband chatting in the kitchen. But then my niece Emma, who's about 5, looked at me and said something that made my blood run cold. She looked at me with those big, curious eyes and said it like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Uncle, I was playing with the funny man in the basement." Those words came out of her mouth so naturally, like it was just any other story. But the problem was, the basement of the house was locked. I knew this because, as long as I could remember, it had always been a forbidden place. I never liked the idea of going down there, and my sister always told the kids not to go, saying it was messy and dangerous. At first, I thought it was just a kid's imagination. Kids, you know how they are. They make up stuff. But still, I felt a chill. I went to the kitchen where my sister was and casually asked, "Hey, the basement is locked, right?" She looked at me and said, without hesitation, "Yeah, of course. It's always locked." "Why?" Her answer didn't make me feel any better. It wasn't like she was trying to justify anything or seemed nervous, but the way she answered felt off. It was like it was so obvious that no one would even question it. I decided I needed to check the basement, not just to make sure there was no one down there, but also to see if Emma was really making up something. I went to the door that led to the stairs and found it just as it always was, closed, with the key in the knob. I gave the door a good push to make sure it was really locked, and it was. No one could have gotten in there without someone noticing. So what the hell was my niece talking about? I went back to the living room, and she was there, playing with the others like nothing had happened. When I walked by her, I asked again, more calmly, "Emma, who was this man you were playing with?" She looked at me again, with that innocent look, and said, "He was funny, Uncle. He was telling stories about the dark." As soon as I heard that, I froze. I had the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back to the kitchen, where my sister was still washing dishes, and tried to hide my worry, but I couldn't. My mind was racing. Did someone come in here without anyone noticing? I wondered. It didn't make sense. Then, suddenly, the atmosphere in the house felt different. That weird silence, like something had shifted, but no one else seemed to notice. I couldn't shake the thought from my head. That funny man in the basement. Emma's words kept echoing in my mind. It was like I was waiting for something. Or worse, like I already knew that something was about to happen. I spent the rest of the night trying to act normal, but every time I looked at the kids, an odd feeling would come over me. It didn't seem right. When the kids went to bed, I decided I couldn't let this go. I went down the hall and stopped in front of the basement door again. Something inside me screamed not to go, but I couldn't resist. With the key in hand, I opened the basement door and slowly descended the stairs. The wood creaked so loudly it felt like it was going to wake up the whole house. The air down there was thick and cold, a mix of mildew and oldness. The lights were dim, which made the place feel even more oppressive. Everything was just as I remembered it, except different. The shadows on the walls seemed deeper, like they were moving. I took a deep breath and looked around, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. Then I saw it. There, in a dark corner, near the boxes and old furniture covered in sheets, there was a figure. It was standing still, staring at me. It wasn't a person, it was something strange, something unlike anything I'd ever seen. The figure was thin, wearing something odd, like a worn-out outfit, and its face looked distorted, expressionless. I couldn't see clearly, but I knew it wasn't a child, nor anyone from my family. The chill was instant. I was frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening, when the figure, with a sudden movement, turned to the other side, disappearing into the shadows. My whole body trembled, and I couldn't stay down there any longer. I rushed upstairs in panic, locking the basement door behind me. My heart was pounding, and I was sweating. When I entered the living room, everyone was calm, like nothing had happened. But I knew something was wrong. I looked at Emma, who was sitting on the couch, playing with her toys. She saw me and, with an innocent smile, said, "The funny man doesn't like to be seen, Uncle." That sentence hit me like a knife. How did she know that? I didn't know what to do. I didn't tell anyone, didn't want to scare the kids even more. I just left the next day, without explaining anything. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that basement, or who was down there. The strange thing is, after that day, I never heard Emma talking about the funny man again, and the basement was never unlocked. Since I left, I never went back there, and something tells me I never should. I'm not the type of person who gets caught up in the madness of Black Friday, but this year I decided to give it a try. I'd been saving for months to buy some new appliances, and everything was on sale. The mall was packed, everyone running through the halls, shoving past each other like it was a matter of life or death. I just wanted to grab what I needed and get out of there as quickly as possible, but with so many people and so much noise, it was impossible not to feel a little lost. It was around 8 p.m. when I finished everything. My arms were full of bags, my feet were killing me, and I just wanted to get home and crash on the couch for the rest of the night. Then, she appeared. I was walking through the parking lot, heading to my car, when a woman suddenly approached me. She looked about my age, maybe a little older, with messy hair and a worried look on her face. She was holding some bags too, but she seemed lost. She asked me for help finding her car. She said she had parked near the entrance, but couldn't remember exactly where with all the chaos. Now, I'm not the type to talk to strangers, but something about her made me feel like I should help. She looked genuinely distressed, like she was in a hurry and couldn't figure things out on her own. I looked around, seeing the parking lot packed with cars, the lights blinking in every direction. It didn't seem that complicated, so I agreed. I told her I'd help, and she thanked me with a forced smile, a little tense. We walked together between the cars, chatting a bit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The parking lot was eerily quiet, almost empty, and she seemed to be getting more and more rushed. When she finally found her car, she looked me in the eyes and thanked me again, saying she owed me one. I just laughed, told her it was no big deal, and went to my own car. I was too tired to worry about anything else. I got in my car, threw the bags on the passenger seat, and started the engine. But as I began driving, I noticed something strange. One of the bags I'd bought was missing. I didn't quite understand what happened, so I stopped in the parking lot and looked around, thinking maybe I'd left it somewhere. But nothing. That's when I spotted a folded note on the passenger seat, lying on top of the bags I'd left there. I unfolded it quickly, and the message made my blood run cold. Never trust strangers. I don't know what hit me in that moment, but the feeling was instant. My stomach twisted in a way I'd never felt before. I sat there, frozen, staring at that note as if it had been placed there to haunt me. It wasn't just fear I felt. It was something deeper, like the note was the key to something much bigger and worse than I could imagine. Never trust strangers. It was simple, but it trapped me. My mind started spiraling around the idea that everything I had just experienced was part of something bigger, maybe a plan I couldn't understand yet. I forced myself to get out of the car, trying to shake off the weight of what was beginning to haunt me. But the more I tried to forget, the more this feeling of being manipulated consumed me. When I got home, my mind was a mess, and what bothered me most was knowing that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. When I stepped inside, the quietness of the place caught me off guard, and for a moment, it even gave me a sense of relief, like maybe everything was finally back to normal. I tossed the bags on the table and went to the bathroom, trying to clear my head and forget about that damn note. But when I came out of the bathroom, I noticed something was different. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavier, almost like the house was somehow waiting for me. The silence was thick, suffocating, like something was hidden in the shadows, watching. I froze for a few seconds, feeling a deep sense of unease, and that's when I realized things weren't in the same places. It wasn't just the mess of a busy day. It was something more subtle. What really freaked me out was the feeling that the objects were trying to tell me something, like the house had started breathing. I was already on edge, but little did I know, what was coming next would be far worse than I could imagine. That's when I noticed the painting on the wall. I was absolutely sure it hadn't been there before. The painting wasn't big, but it was the kind of piece that always made me think of something unsettling. It was a strange, blurry painting of an empty field, with trees that seemed to lean forward as if they wanted to swallow me. I had left it in the drawer of the dining table a few days ago, but now it was on the wall, as if it had never been taken out of there. I'm not the type to believe in supernatural stuff, but this didn't make sense. The feeling that someone had invaded my house and moved everything was almost unbearable. I walked up to the painting, touched the frame, and a cold sensation ran down my arm, like something was watching me up close, waiting for me to realize. Every muscle in my body tensed. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. It was the knowledge that something was terribly wrong, and I no longer had control over what was happening. I walked into the living room and started looking for anything else that had been moved, but I didn't find anything obvious. Until, when I glanced at my phone, I saw there was a message. My heart jumped. It was from an unknown number. The message was direct, short, and blunt. "You shouldn't have helped her." I froze for a second. Who was this her? The woman in the parking lot? But how? I was starting to panic, sinking deeper into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. I even started to wonder if I was going crazy, if my mind was making all of this up. But the painting, the message, none of this was something I could just ignore. I didn't know what to think anymore. My mind was a mess, and the air in my house seemed heavier with every passing minute. I decided to go to my room and try to rest, but as I walked through the kitchen, I noticed something even more disturbing. The shopping bag with my purchases was open on the floor. I hadn't left it there. I knew that for sure. But the strangest part was that one of the items was unwrapped, and the watch I had bought, one of the best deals of Black Friday, was gone. My heart raced. There were no more doubts. Someone was inside my house, someone was watching me, but I still didn't know who or what was behind this. The tension in the air seemed to grow stronger as time went on. I decided to call the police, but before I could do that, I heard a noise coming from downstairs. It was a crack, followed by heavy footsteps. I didn't need to think twice. I grabbed my phone, called the police, and only then did I realize that the feeling of fear had become an overwhelming weight. When the police arrived, there was no one but me. But after I checked the security footage, the recording showed something I'll never forget. A woman, with a strange smile, watching me through the living room window, and I never heard from her again.